Okay, so last time we looked at a bunch of evidence that people have adduced for the idea that there is a critical period active in second language learning. Um, well, let me start even before that. So, in the first part of this unit, we saw evidence that most people agree that there are critical period effects for first language acquisition. Um, Earlier, we saw that there's some evidence for such effects from non first languages. This is what I called critical period hypothesis for second language acquisition. Um, what we're going to hear about today is a bunch of counter evidence. So there's a lot of people who think that this critical period evidence for second language acquisition, that these effects are basically not real. And so one thing you see in this literature is that there's not much agreement on whether or not there are critical periods for second language acquisition. One of the things I'm going to conclude today is that actually the disagreements are sort of smaller and less substantive than they might seem when you look at this literature and find people arguing back and forth. And that actually this is because we're sort of converging on the truth here. And so the remaining differences between these pro-critical period and anti-critical period camps are getting smaller and smaller. They actually agree on more than you might think. So basically, most of the evidence in this anti-critical period literature for second language acquisition takes one of two forms. We're going to look at one paper of each kind today. And so the first criticism here, which I've already hinted at in previous weeks, is this evidence that says, well, really, these age of acquisition effects, which we all agree exist, that the older somebody starts acquiring a language, the lower their ultimate attainment tends to be. One line of criticism says that, well, that's really not because of the age of acquisition itself, but because of other factors that correlate with that. So whether this is motivational factors or attitude factors, emotional factors, sociocultural factors, it just tends to be the case that people who started acquiring a language earlier have more formal education, they've spent longer speaking the language, they're more motivated to use the language in their day-to-day life, and they might feel more of a cultural affinity with that language, as well as any other kinds of sociocultural or attitude kinds of factors. That's what's causing the age of acquisition effect. And there's nothing about age of acquisition per se, right, in and of itself, that dictates how well or how poorly you're ultimately going to achieve grammatical competence in a second language. This is really about all the factors that correlate with age of acquisition. So that's one line of argumentation. And then the other line of argumentation is that when you examine the actual learning curve in all of its quantitative detail, that there's no sudden discontinuities in that learning curve by age of arrival. Instead, it's like a steady decline that's not consistent with a qualitative change in language acquisition at some age. I think both of these lines of argumentation themselves, which are pointing out problems with the critical period hypothesis for second language acquisition, both of these lines of criticism themselves suffer from a lot of problems. And so let's take a look briefly at one paper of each kind. This paper by Jim Flege and colleagues from 1999 is trying to test that critical period by more precise measurements of the age of acquisition or age of arrival curve, as well as looking at these confounds we noted earlier between attitudinal, motivational, sociocultural factors and age of acquisition. So if you recall, when we talked about the critical period hypothesis, I suggested that any one of these shapes could be consistent with a critical period hypothesis. And these are all slightly different, these shapes, but what they all have in common is that there's at least one sort of sudden discontinuity in the function from age of acquisition to ultimate grammatical competence. Now, this kind of a schematic plot doesn't show exactly what should be on this vertical axis, and this is going to be important. So it's just labeled ultimate attainment here, which is really a notion relating to grammatical competence, right? To language as an information processing system, computational level theory. Of course, we only get to directly examine specific tasks and specific linguistic behaviors. Most of the papers we've seen so far in the second language literature, at least, are looking at these grammaticality judgment tasks, right? And these surely reflect grammatical competence, but they're not the only thing that reflects grammatical competence. That's just one tiny part of all the linguistic behaviors that people engage in, right? So this paper, first of all, is going to look at a little bit wider range of data. So they will do this kind of grammaticality judgment task that's modeled after the original Newport and Johnson paper, or Johnson and Newport paper. But then they're also going to look at a phonetic, or what they call phonological acquisition, although I would say it's phonetic. And this is just consisting of native speaker judgments of second language speakers' accents, right? So it's, ideally you might want to have some notion of acoustically, how does a speaker of English or some other language produce all of these particular speech sounds, and then measure the acoustics of second language learners and see how close they are to achieving native-like targets. That it is an incredible amount of work to do that acoustic analysis, and we don't have a full and complete theory of exactly what the acoustics of the sounds of any language are like. So the sort of shortcut they're using here is a perceptual task. Well, how do you know if somebody's achieved native-like pronunciation, or how native-like their pronunciation is? Well, if native speakers think they sound like a native, then they've achieved native-like pronunciation. That's the idea here. And so they're going to look at native speaker judgments of L2 speakers' accents in addition to the standard grammaticality judgment task. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between these two kinds of tasks in a moment. Before getting there, I should say, let me save this for one more slide. Basic ideas here, Flege and colleagues are saying that the critical period hypothesis predicts a sigmoid or S-like relationship between ultimate attainment and age of acquisition, and not a straight declining line. Right? So what does that mean? This would be an example of a sigmoid curve. This particular one is a backwards S. Of course, if you plotted this differently, it could be a forwards S. But the basic idea here is that there's a plateau, there's a giant drop-off, which is a discontinuity in the function, and then there's another low plateau. So that's going to be another discontinuity. There's going to be several discontinuities in this function where if you acquire the language during your critical period, you're native-like. As you get towards the end of that critical period, attainment starts to decrease. And then if you start acquiring the language after your critical period, you're sort of equally bad down at the bottom here. And so that's what Flege and colleagues are assuming should be evidence for a critical period hypothesis. Now, I've said I find either one of these curves also to be consistent with that. But what they say specifically is that a declining straight diagonal line, which is not shown here, that's the kind of curve that's not compatible with a critical period hypothesis. So what are they going to do here? They're going to get a bunch of data. They're going to compare a model of that data that assumes that it's like a straight diagonal line declining, and then they're going to compare that to another model that assumes that the data should be fit by a sigmoid curve, like this one, right? And they're going to see which one of these models quantitatively fits the data better. And I should say that it's actually guaranteed that the sigmoid model, mathematically guaranteed, will fit the data better. So they actually also have to trade this off against some measure of complexity. This is not an entirely trivial statistical issue, but for the moment, let's just assume they're using the right methods for comparing these models. They're basically going to ask which one of these models is better at fitting our data. And if it's the sigmoid one, then that would be evidence for a critical period in second language acquisition. If it's the straight line one, then that would be evidence against the critical period hypothesis. A second idea from Flege and colleagues is that the critical period hypothesis predicts that critical period learners should decline with their age of acquisition, but post-critical period learners should not. I'm not sure why that would be the case necessarily. That would basically correspond to this curve as far as I can tell. And yeah, it's not clear to me why they're assuming that. I think you could have another of other assumptions, but that's what they're going to be looking at. And then maybe the most important thing to take away from this paper is trying to look at how age of arrival or age of acquisition may be confounded with other variables, as I mentioned earlier. And so the way they're going to try to defend against this is by grouping people together who are matched for some of their other variables, like length of formal education or motivational factors, And then looking at those matched subgroups, we're going to try to see if age of acquisition is still a significant predictor of attainment on these particular linguistic tasks. So before I get into the data, I should say here, I find this paper to be outrageously biased. So basically, at every stage, the authors here seem to be ignoring evidence for the critical period hypothesis and combing for evidence that it goes against the critical period hypothesis. I think there's a huge number of problems with this paper, both rhetorically and conceptually, as well as just empirically and quantitatively. But that said, it's been pretty influential in the field. It's one of the more detailed quantitative studies in this area, and it definitely has influenced a lot of studies that came later. But I mean, for reasons that we'll probably see shortly, at least some of them, I think a lot of the argumentation here is just wrong. That said, let's have a look at what they did, and I can explain what I think the problems are. So here's their sort of marquee results. This is from the two tasks. So what do we see here? This is, again, a kind of learning curve with AOA on the horizontal axis here, and specific linguistic tasks on the vertical axis here. So this one is the foreign accent rating. And what you can see, these open circles up here are showing you how native English speakers rate native English speakers. So this is basically AOA 0. And, you know, they're rated mostly very native English-like with a little bit of variation. So some native English speakers sound a little bit less native than others for whatever reason. But basically, this is meant to show you the native speaker range of foreign accent ratings. And then all of the filled in circles are native Korean speakers who moved to the United States at various ages. And as you can see here, with the exception of this guy, most people who moved to the United States in early childhood have pretty close to native-like accent ratings. And then as their age of arrival gets older and older, it kind of declines, past age 20 or so. And it keeps bottoming out this whole time. Similarly, over here, this is the morphosyntax scores, which I take to be a subset of those grammaticality judgment tasks. And again, this is the native speaker range, and people who arrive in early childhood tend to score almost all in the native range here. And as that AOA gets older, you get, again, more variability at this end of the scale. So that's replicating the patterns that we saw in the earlier studies, as well as lower average performance on this task. And yeah, so this is the data again. Interestingly here, we're seeing a much steeper slope for the foreign accent rating than we are for these grammaticality judgment tasks. And I think this is completely intuitive, right? So anybody who's spent a long time with a foreign language that isn't your native language, pronunciation is almost never going to be native-like unless you started studying the language as a young child, right? So I think just about all of us that speak second languages probably have some kind of a foreign accent in that language, and just intuitively, it's incredibly hard to get native-like pronunciation in a second language. On the other hand, well-formedness judgments about syntax and morphology and agreement and things like that, these just don't seem as hard to me in a foreign language. And these data seem to be bearing that out, which to me is a sort of common sense intuition that, of course, you're going to do better on judging the well-formedness of sentences than you are at producing producing sound sequences or phonetic sequences in a foreign language. And that's what the data here are showing us. This is interesting for a couple reasons. One of them is that we looked earlier at these sort of UG, universal grammar-based explanations of critical periods in second language acquisition. And they seemed, if anything, to maybe predict the opposite of this, right? So if the idea is that you have your universal grammar, and it's intact in your critical period, and then the critical period ends and you lose your UG, then it should affect areas of language more that use more UG, at least at a first pass. That was what we thought. And as I mentioned in that earlier lecture, UG is least controversial. So just about everybody who studies syntax agrees that there's some kind of innate learning biases, in other words, universal grammar, active in syntactic learning. And it's much less well established in phonological learning or phonetic learning at all that there's any kind of innate learning biases or UG. So you might predict that the loss of UG should make it harder to do syntactic competence kinds of tasks than tasks that rely on phonetic competence. But what we're seeing here is the opposite. That said, I do think there's another sort of common sense way of looking at these that would get the predictions right. And it's a little bit more subtle than this, right? So the fact that there are strong learning biases and structural biases in learning syntax and morphology might actually mean that languages just don't vary as much in this regard. Right? And so for those of you who've taken syntax, these broad principles like structure dependence and headed hierarchical phrase structure, constituency, the theta criterion and theta theory, these all sort of predict that languages only differ in a very limited number of ways because you have lots and lots of machinery in UG that guides and constrains learning, right, in syntax. And what that means is that a priori, at a first pass, any foreign language is going to have more in common with your native language syntactically than you might expect from just random chance. So another way of looking at this is because UG constrains the extent to which languages are able to differ, that more UG heavy tasks should actually be easier to master in a foreign language if you've acquired a first language that, by hypothesis, also involves UG. On the other hand, phonetics, there's not that much out there except for physical constraints on your articulatory system. There's not a ton out there for universals. There's doesn't seem to be any particularly strong innate biases for phonetics that aren't also just part of general hearing, right? So there's biases from general hearing, there's biases from the physical properties of your articulatory system, but there's not that much language-specific kinds of innate biases there that don't also apply to other things outside language. And in that sense, maybe phonetics of languages are just less constrained, right? So it's much closer to anything goes in phonetics, and that at a first pass would predict that languages should differ more in these dimensions, and any second language will therefore be harder to acquire. Right? There's a second thing to say about that, though, about these comparisons, which is, again, looking at these vertical axes here. We're not measuring grammatical competence in either one of these tasks. All we can measure here is people's particular performance on these particular tasks. And so another explanation for this might just be that you picked a super hard task to represent pronunciation, and you picked a much easier task to represent morphosyntax. So it's very hard to say because these are not using the same task, and how could they, right? It's very hard to directly compare performance on these two. So all of these findings about the difference between pronunciation versus grammar, as this is sometimes put in the SLA literature, these all need to be taken with a large grain of salt because we can't ever compare the same behavior, right, across pronunciation and grammar, as it's often put in these papers. And more generally, we're not measuring competence here. We can't measure the computational level properties of language as an information processing system. All we can do is measure specific behaviors. So that said, we can draw some other conclusions from these, or at least Flege and colleagues try to. And so the curves in these graphs, you can see this sigmoid curve here with two discontinuities in it, and the same thing here, flat line, decline, and then flattening here. These curves are the best fit according to their statistical criteria. Right? So that means that these sigmoid curves fit the data better than a straight diagonal line down. Right? So they compared these two models and found that the sigmoid curves are the best models here. And I think any common sense interpretation of this paper would say, well, I guess that is the findings of the paper, that the critical period hypothesis matches these data better than the steady decline AOA model. Somehow, Flege and colleagues interpret this as evidence against the critical period hypothesis, which as many times as I look back at this paper, I wonder how this ever got into publication. I don't understand the reasoning here. It's really pretty odd to me. This seems like clear evidence. If you were going to lay out beforehand what you think the results of the experiment ought to be based on the critical period hypothesis versus its absence, I think these results would be straightforwardly evidence for the critical period hypothesis. They interpret these as evidence against it. As far as I can understand, this is because their claim is that where these discontinuities take hold, or where the bottoming out happens here, is like around 15 or 16 years old. And that's after puberty, and therefore that's inconsistent with the critical period, which I think is just nonsensical. I don't think that argument makes any sense. Anyhow, that's what they conclude from this, and I'm not sure why. These results are still interesting, even if I don't agree with their interpretation of the results. This is another kind of cool one here. So we looked earlier in the Johnson and Newport paper at some of the grammaticality judgment tasks, and we saw that some of them are based on quite general properties of English grammar, like agreement between nouns and verbs, or how regular plurals work and agree with numerals, things like WH movement, and things like that are really general grammatical properties of English. Those are referred to here as rule-based, and you can see there's a particular kind of fit here for those items where people seem to be native-like. At this age, they show a decline, but it's a relatively shallow decline, and even the adult learners at this end are not bad at these rule-based kinds of things. Other ones that we saw, though, involved idiosyncratic lexical properties. These were things like irregular plurals. The plural of foot is not foots, it's feet, or irregular past tenses. The past tense of speak is not speaked, it's spoke. And for these kinds of lexically based problems, you can see the decline here is much steeper. So if you arrive after age 10, it's very likely that you're going to see a precipitous drop-off in how well people do on these more lexically idiosyncratic tasks, until people who arrive in adulthood are almost at chance level of performance, like they're just randomly guessing almost on these particular judgments. And so that's quite interesting. This is probably pointing us to, again, interesting differences within different kinds of linguistic tasks, showing us again that grammar is not monolithic, language is not monolithic. There are an infinite variety of behaviors that are governed by linguistic knowledge. Some of them are going to give us more insight than others about underlying systems of competence. So that to me is quite interesting. And then in the remainder of the paper, they try to address these confounds with other sociocultural and emotional factors. And again, Flege and colleagues are going to claim in the end that the age of arrival, age of acquisition effects that they find here can be entirely explained by some combination of how long people have been in the country, their general perceptual ability, how well they process any sounds, not just linguistic ones, English media input, how much motivation they have to integrate into American culture, how much motivation they have to use the language for their day-to-day lives or work situations. That some combination of these is going to explain all of the AOA effects. But that's, again, not what the data actually show here, as far as I can tell. This is a table where they list the most important predictors in these data in order of how much variance in the data they explain. So what does that mean? Well, what we have here is a whole bunch of data from a whole bunch of different people, and people differ in their performance on these tasks. And there's a way to quantify exactly how much people differ. We refer to that as the variance of the data. And then incorporating any kind of explanatory factor into the data, like, well, maybe some of the differences between people are based on the age at which they arrived in the United States, and you can quantitatively fit the numbers to the AOA curve, and that will explain away some of the differences we find between people. So we say in statistical jargon that this will explain a proportion of the variance in the data, and of course we'll never explain 100% of the variance in any data set. But we can also compare different variables to see how much variance do they explain, how much of the differences, the ways in which subjects differ on these tasks, how much of that can be explained by the factors that we're examining in this study versus some residue of variance that's just going to be unexplained, right? So here's what they find here. By far, the most explanatory variable here is the age of second language learning onset. Right? So this is explaining a huge proportion of the variance. About one way to interpret this R-squared number is that the model with just AOA as a predictor of how people do on these tasks explains 68% of the variance on the pronunciation task here. This is the foreign accent task. And so that's a lot. It's explaining most of the differences between people in this data set. As you put more and more other factors in, you explain a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more of the variance here. So if you add in how long they've been in the country on top of their age of arrival, you get another 4% or so of the variance explained. Put in their general sound processing ability, you get another 3%. Their English media input, you get another 2%. Eventually, we end up with about 80%, 79% of the variance in the data being explained by these 6 variables. But by far, the lion's share of that is explained by the AOA curve. All the rest of these sociocultural, attitudinal, emotive factors are explaining only a little bit more of the data. Last thing here that they do is involves these matched subgroups where we find, hey, here are people who have been in the country for roughly the same amount of time, but a mismatch for age of acquisition. Here's a subset of people who came to the country at the same age, but they've been here for different lengths of time. Let's look at these subsets and see how robust these differences in AOA and versus the confounding factors are in these subsets. And they sort of interpret all of these different matched subset analyses in this crazy way that makes no sense to me, where unsurprisingly, at the end of this process, the conclusion that comes out is, yeah, all of the AOA effects in our data are explained by other sociocultural factors. And I just think this is plain wrong. Again, I would, if I were a reviewer on this paper, I would absolutely reject this part of the paper. It makes no sense the way they interpret these. Very briefly, I can say that the main problem here is that they're keep splitting and splitting and splitting their data into smaller and smaller and smaller groups where they have less and less and less data, right, in each group. And then they do statistical testing, and based on whether the statistical tests come out quote unquote significant or not, they then decide to dismiss that or conclude that some of these factors in the data are not real, because as you keep splitting the data into smaller and smaller and smaller groups, the effects aren't as strong anymore. And this makes absolutely no sense to me. If people want to know more about that criticism, I'd be happy to correspond about it, but I'm not going to go into all the quantitative details here because it's really mostly a statistical argument. Yeah, what I will say is that I don't get where these conclusions are coming from. It seems clear to me that these researchers went into this study hoping to find no critical period effects in second language acquisition, and they have decided to just interpret their data that way, no matter what actually happens in the data. As far as I can tell here, all these data are not only consistent with, but are actually pretty strong evidence for the idea of critical period effects in second language acquisition. So this first paper that's criticizing the second language critical period hypothesis seems really totally off base to me. That said, it's been very influential. Maybe I'm wrong about these things, but I figured I'd present both sides. But in my sort of attempt to present this paper, it's hard not to introduce my biases because I think the arguments in the paper are really deeply, deeply flawed. But that's the Flege and colleagues paper. This is a very flashy study from Hakuta and colleagues. And I think this comes out of the Ellen Bialystock lab. And she's been one of the principal people trying to argue against the critical periods for second language acquisition for 20 or 30 years now. Yeah, she's come up with, again, very influential in this area. And she's sort of staked her claim on being the anti-critical period person in the second language acquisition literature. This is a very neat idea for a study. They've taken the United States Census data, right? So they have a database of millions of subjects who moved to the country after birth, right, at some different age. And what this basically is a massive database of people organized by AOA, millions and millions of subjects in this quote unquote experiment. One of the questions on the census data, on the census form apparently, is a self-reported proficiency at English on a 5-point scale. Right? So what they have here is a little tiny linguistic task here, which is, hey, report how good you are at speaking English on a 5-point scale, but averaged over millions and millions and millions of people. And the idea here is that you could use that as a learning curve, right? Just the same way we've been looking at the effects of AOA on ultimate attainment in experiments, we can do the same thing in this observational study with millions of people. And they're going to mainly be interested in whether the shape, the dependent variable that comes out of this, the learning curve, has a linear shape, again, that straight diagonal line going downwards, which is said to be inconsistent with the critical period, or whether there's an obvious discontinuity in that function. And the way that they use a particular kind of regression analysis in this paper, based on assumptions about what the function ought to look like under different hypotheses, they argue that the linear downward sloping line is a pretty decent model of these census data when you regress out other variables like these kinds of confounding sociocultural factors. And again, so this study, it is a neat idea to use the census data. I think there's, again, a large number of problems with this study, starting with the fact that it uses a 5-point Likert scale. This is not a serious task for assessing people's grammatical competence. And so even if everything else about the study were right, I don't think I'd take this as very strong evidence against a critical period for second language acquisition. But it also turns out I think you could also argue with all of the other specific technical and statistical details here. This is just a very hard thing to kind of do, to really regress out and adjust for all other confounding variables when you have such a coarse dependent variable to begin with, this 5-point scale, and there's millions of subjects here, and everything's confounded. I don't think you're really going to be able to look at the fine-grained details of how the AOA curve is shaped using these kinds of messy, noisy, raw data. That said, actually, all of this to some extent, I think, is beside the point. And this is the sort of bringing it all back home moment of this unit. Here's the crucially important issue here. It's not really technical at all, although I'm going to be trying to show you this with fake data plots. It's really a conceptual issue, and it again goes back to what's on this vertical axis. So this is fake data that I simulated on my computer using random number generators, as well as an underlying model of how people do tasks, right? And here's a learning curve, right? This is fake age of acquisition. So we're pretending that we have subjects who came to the United States at all different ages. And this is how long it takes them to respond to some kind of grammatical prompt. To, let's say, recognize that this is a word or something like that. Response time data is one very, very frequent kind of data that gets used in psycholinguistics experiments. And it's how long does it take you to perform some task that relies on your knowledge of English grammar. And this is completely typical kinds of data that you might see in a task like this, where people who are very good at the task do things very, 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 very quickly. And then as people get worse and worse at the task, you get a huge amount of variability, but these reaction times lengthen logarithmically. What does that mean? Well, unfortunately, we have all seen a lot more logarithmic curves recently than we ever would have hoped for. It's an exponential function like the COVID-19 virus or any other pandemic. It means that when things go up, they don't go up proportionally to our measurement, which in this case is like milliseconds. Instead, they go up in a ratio-based function, so maybe it doubles for every 2 additional years of age of acquisition or something like that. And so this is extremely typical for time-based measurements in psycholinguistics experiments. You find that time works in a ratio-based or logarithmic manner in language, and not in a simple additive, hey, add 20 milliseconds kind of a manner. And so this is what's on the vertical axis in this particular fake data task. You absolutely could get things that look like this in a critical period study on second language acquisition. You'd have an AOA curve like this, and you'd find that after some critical age, maybe it's like 15 in here or something, that for every additional year people are older when they come to the United States, that their reaction times basically go up logarithmically. This would be a totally typical finding. And then what would you conclude from that? Well, there must be a critical period because there's a strong discontinuity in this age of acquisition curve, right? So things are pretty steady up until here, and then they go wild. So that's a discontinuity. But again, we're not measuring competence here. This is one particular task with one particular kind of response function, which in this case will tend to be logarithmic. One way of dealing with this, and this is also very typical in psycholinguistics research, I can take the exact same data set, but treat it with a more principled model that says, hey, time is logarithmic. Here's what it looks like. This is the log response time, which is a more principled way of measuring people's response times in language-related tasks. This is the exact same data set. I haven't changed any of the numbers, random or otherwise, in this data set, but now, all of a sudden, this is a perfectly straight diagonal line, indicating a decline with age in performance, which means an increase of reaction time. Right? And so what would we say about this hypothetical data set? So the claim is not that any particular linguistic task actually looks like this. This is meant to be a more general point about the logic behind these arguments, namely that whether or not there's a discontinuity in any particular data set related to age of acquisition, age of arrival, is going to be entirely a function of how we measure people's behavior. If we measure it in milliseconds, then we have evidence for a critical period hypothesis. If we measure it in log milliseconds, then there's no evidence for a critical period hypothesis, but it's the same data set. And so this is pointing us to a problem not with data measurements or AOA functions or anything like that. It's pointing us to a problem with the logic of these arguments. Whether or not a particular behavior looks like it shows discontinuity or not is entirely a function of how we measure that behavior. Right? And it's not going to teach us anything about critical periods or UG or innateness or anything. All it's going to teach us about is the shapes of different kinds of linguistic behavioral functions against age, right? And it's not really teaching us about the age of acquisition itself. It's teaching us about different ways of measuring linguistic behavior, right? Which is not uninteresting, but it just really is never going to be strong evidence for or against these very general hypotheses about language and linguistic competence and computational level information processing accounts of how linguistic knowledge works. All these are ever going to be is evidence about specific linguistic behaviors, right? A way of putting this that sort of harks back to the earliest themes of this class is that really the critical period hypothesis is about MAR level 1 concerns. It's a claim or an assertion about how linguistic competence works, grammatical knowledge. But all of these studies are measuring algorithmic level processes, right? They're not giving us accounts of grammatical competence, they're giving us accounts of linguistic behavior, and only a very narrow range of linguistic behaviors as well. Here's another example that's trying to show basically the same thing. This is a little bit closer to the actual tasks that we see in the Flege paper and the other papers. This is showing us proportion correct judgments. And again, this is fake data that I've made up through a simulation. with quantitative assumptions that look a lot like real data. So you can see that at the low end of age of acquisition here, people are native-like and there's little variation. And as you get older, you get a decline in performance and lots more variation. So this is fake data that I've cooked up to look like actual data from Johnson and Newport and Flege and colleagues. And the question here, again, for these folks is going to be, is there a sudden discontinuity in these data across age of acquisition, or is there instead a long, steady diagonal line decline? And I've cooked these data up so that there is a strong discontinuity. Basically, people are native up until age 13, and then everything starts declining rapidly from there on in and keeps going, getting worse and worse until middle age, basically. Right? So this is a data set that I cooked up to show a clear discontinuity of the kind that we've seen in these papers. And so, excuse me, if you're trying to evaluate the critical period hypothesis based on this specific linguistic task, right, you're going to look at these data and conclude, oh yeah, there's a discontinuity in the AOA function in the learning curve, therefore the critical period is right for second language learners. Right? Exact same data plotted in a more principled way. Here, instead of using the percent correct judgments, we use what's called a logit transform. The details of this are not super important. It's a way of changing binary choice data into continuous data that allows it to be modeled more accurately. And so the logit stands for the log odds of a particular correct choice. This is the exact same data, fake data, simulated data, but the same numbers simply plotted using a logit transformation, which is the correct way to analyze these categorical data. This has not been done, incidentally, in any of the studies we've looked at, because in the 90s and 2000s, it was much less well appreciated that you needed to use these kinds of logit models for categorical data. Instead, it was traditional to just model the percentage correct. But you take the exact same data plotted in logits, all of a sudden we have a perfectly straight diagonal line kind of decline across the lifespan. So again, this is not an argument that this is the only way or the right way to look at the data, or that this is the only way or the right way to look at the data. It's an argument that whether or not these data, quote unquote, support the critical period hypothesis is entirely a function of how you measure the data, right? So what this is showing us is that my point here is that it's going to be largely futile, right, to argue and quibble about the minor quantitative aspects of these AOA curves. Is there a discontinuity here? Does a sigmoid model fit better? That's entirely a function of the kind of data that you've gathered and the way you've measured it. It's not going to teach us anything about critical periods. It's a waste of time to argue and quibble about the shapes of these AOA curves, unless the point of it is to get us a better statistical model of our particular data. Then of course it's worth concerning ourselves with these little quantitative details. But it's not going to tell us anything grand or conceptual about the AOA curve or critical periods. In the end, what we're seeing here is actually that all of these studies largely agree. They agree on almost all of the facts here. There's a large and extremely meaningful and significant decline in people's ultimate attainment in grammaticality judgment tasks and native-like pronunciation as the lifespan goes along. Nobody disputes that. People who arrive during early childhood, begin acquiring a language during early childhood, ultimately end up being, on average, much more native-like in that language than people who arrive later. There's been no part of the lifespan in any of these studies where we haven't seen AOA declines. Furthermore, it seems to generally be the case that that decline in ultimate attainment, based on the kinds of things we've been able to measure, looks like it's steeper, right, at older ages than it is at younger ages. Although again, that's going to be entirely a function of how you choose to measure the data. That might not be telling us anything particularly important or significant about critical periods. And then it's also the case that age of acquisition is almost always confounded with other factors, with how long you've been in the country, level of formal education, how motivated you are to use the language, how integrated you feel in the culture, and so on and so forth. And so it's somewhat difficult to attribute all of the age-related declines that we find on these specific linguistic tasks to people's age when they arrived. But that said, age of acquisition does seem to be the most significant and the most influential variable in all of the studies that we've seen so far. Right? So it seems to have the largest independent effect on ultimate attainment at these particular tasks than any of the other variables we've looked at. And it's not entirely clear what the best model is quantitatively for how people decline with age. You can sort of make an argument one way or the other about what the best shape for your model is, but what everybody basically agrees on is that there are large and pretty rapid declines as the age of acquisition gets older. And one group of researchers has chosen to label these data as consistent with a critical period, and the other group of researchers doesn't like the label critical period applied to these age of acquisition effects, but they actually almost entirely agree on what's going on here. So the sort of final question here, that's the uplifting part of this, is like, actually, we've learned a lot from this literature, and we all basically agree on what's happening here. We just don't agree on what to call it. And so the last question is going to be why? Why has there been so much and sometimes bitter disagreement in this literature about whether there are critical period effects in second language acquisition? And I want to suggest, and this is more my speculation here, but I want to suggest that it has to do with this grand difference that we started out with this semester between empiricism and rationalism, right? And I think what's going on here is that the anti-critical period people just really don't like the idea that language is special. Right? They want language to work just like any other developmental faculty, just like any other cognitive faculty. And if that's the case, then we don't think there are critical period effects for, other kinds of cognitive faculties, or at least they don't. Actually, rationalists think there probably would be. But these empiricists, these anti-modularists, people who think everything is domain general, and they think that all cognition works alike, and therefore there ought not to be any biological specializations for any of this stuff. Therefore, they ought not to show critical period effects. And so whatever data they get, they interpret it through the filter of there can't be critical periods for language because language is based on domain general principles of cognition. Whereas the pro-critical period camp, I would guess, are much more inclined to the sort of universal grammar Chomskyan view of the world. And so, according to their thinking, well, there's universal grammar, that's indisputable for first language acquisition. It ought to apply to second language acquisition as well, and therefore there ought to be critical period effects because language is special, right? And so whatever data they get, they interpret it through the lens of, yes, there ought to be critical period effects here. So really, in the end, I think that these arguments in this literature are just another manifestation of this sociological split in the language sciences between basically people who are nativists and people who are empiricists. But the actual data here, everybody's data largely agrees in this area. There are large AOA-related declines. They are particularly precipitous after puberty. And people who acquire a foreign language as adults show huge variability that, at least according to that De Keyser paper, is correlated with their general verbal aptitude at different kinds of classroom tasks in a way that people who acquire a language in early childhood don't vary, right? So that's, I think, as close as you can get to confirming the critical period hypothesis for second language acquisition, but you find people who dissent from that and don't want to label such a decline as a critical period effect, which is fine. It's just a matter of how we're using technical vocabulary. We all agree more or less on what's happening here. So that's my conclusion from this second language acquisition literature. Next, we're going to go on in the final unit of this class to look more directly at arguments for nativism and objections to those arguments in the real stronghold domain of generative grammar and Chomskyan linguistics, which is syntactic acquisition. So that's going to be what we look at next.